Hello and welcome to the third video of the series about creating CRUD pages using NextJS and Redux-Observable. Be patient as this one is a bit long. In the previous video, we have created a getUsers API that returns a list of user information stored in a local Prisma database. If you find this video helpful, please subscribe. Independent of that, it's now time to create our Redux module for the user and configure the application store. Redux is an open source JavaScript library for keeping the application state centralized. It is the single source of truth for our application. We need to create action creators, actions, and reducers to modify the state. From the UI onload event, it will dispatch a retrieve users action which will call the list users API to get the user information from the database. It is done with the help of Redux-Observable, a middleware to perform async actions through epics. Once a response is received, it will dispatch another action with the response as a parameter set in the store via reducer. Updating the state will trigger an update in our UI as well. Let's start by adding a Redux folder under the SRC to save all the Redux related components. Let's create a modules folder to save all our modules. A module is a JavaScript file that simply groups together all actions, action creators, reducers, and epics. Under this folder, create usermodule.js. Define our initial state, which is an object that contains error and status, whether the operation that has been performed is inserted, deleted, or updated. Create our action retrieve users action type. Here we use action states, which is a function to define the most common state cycle. Under Redux, create a new file module util and add the states. It means we will have retrieve list of users, start, loading, success, and more. Let's import the function. Let's add a reducer. It's a JavaScript function with state and initial state as parameters. Inside the switch block, add the retrieve list success, which returns the users and count values from the API payload. Let's create a default case that returns the current state. Let's define our action creators. This one retrieves a list of users that accepts offset and limit. Let's create our retrieve list of users epic. It is where we use RxJS. If you are not familiar yet with this library, I suggest you visit their website first to understand how it works. For this epic, we are filtering type retrieve list.start. And then we call the getListOfUsers API. After it succeeds or fails, it will again call an action creator to pass the response or error. Don't forget to import all the dependencies by pressing Ctrl+space. Let us now create the retrieve users OK, where we pass the users and count, and retrieve users KO action creators. These parameters will then be passed to the reducer, returned, and saved to the application store in the case of success. Now, let us define and import our HTTP utility RxBackend under source utils folder. It's a simple utility file that contains functions to perform HTTP operations such as GET. We have added headers parameters if we want to append new headers to the default, which is the authorization header used to get the user making the request. In the HTTP methods, we define the configuration and call the joint function AJAX request, where we have set the base URL that we have defined in the environment file. Inside, we call the function request from RxJS. In the epic, we pass the relative URL, the users list API. And finally, let's export the epics. Next, let's create modules.js under src redux. In this file, we consolidate all our modules. Import epics and reducer from user module and export like this. Let's create our application store under src redux, which is a copy of the one available from the NextJS example with Redux-Observable. Check the file under store.js. The GitHub repository pretty much explained this file's usage, so I will not repeat it here. Seems like we forgot to add Redux DevTools --extension as a dev dependency. Going back to the application store, we import the epics and reducer from modules, combine the epics, and run the epics middleware. To integrate the application store into our app, open src_app.js. Import the uStore from the application store, this uStore. Let's spread the store and persistor. Add a component provider that accepts the store as a parameter and persist gate, which delays rendering our app's UI until the persisted state has been retrieved and saved to Redux. Make sure to import these components. Let's add a loading text here. It can be customized into a component. Next, we need to edit our user's view to display the user information that we have retrieved from the API. Let's create our selector to get the users and count from the store. A selector function is any function that accepts the Redux store state or part of the state as an argument and returns data that is based on that state. We instruct useSelector to get users, count, and status from the user store, which we export from modules. Then return these values when useUser is called. And this is that user, an object that contains users and count from the user module's reducer. As for the status, it is defined in the initial state. We are ready to call the useUsers function. Let's create a constant hasUsers that is true if the user's length is greater than 0. The table row contains the user information. Let's check if hasUser is true. If it's true, let's iterate through each row using map. Otherwise, let's show a no users found message. Going back to the diagram, for the UI to be updated, there needs to be an update in the store. And to do that, we need to dispatch an action that will trigger an epic that will call our retrieve users API. It is done inside useEffect. Let's create an offset and limit constant with default values. Offset, the row number from index 0, and limit is the number of records that will be taken. Let's add offset and limit as parameters of the useEffect, only to call it when these parameters change. Don't forget to import these functions from React and Redux. During page load, it will pass through this useEffect and dispatch the retrieve users action. It will set the type to retrieve list.start, which the middleware will pick up and call the retrieve users epic. This is where the request to retrieve users API happens, retrieving information from the user table. This includes the list of users and count. If successful, retrieve users awk function will be called with type retrieve_users.success with the list of users and count as parameters. This will be received in the store via reducer. This update in the store will trigger an action in the UI via useSelector. The updated values of users, count, and status will be pushed here. Let's check our code one last time for missing imports or any compile time issues. Once you are confident that there's no more error, open localhost port 3000/users in your browser. For debugging purposes, you can press F12 and open the Networks tab. Alright, seems like we're missing something. Sometimes, A simple refresh solves the issue. Oops. Limit must not be 0. Debugging like this makes finding an error easier. Let's update the limit value to 10 and wait for the page to refresh. And there, we get a glimpse of our UI populated with the user information. And that concludes this video. In summary, we have set up a Redux store for our application and populated the UI with the user information retrieved from the store. In the following video, we will implement the delete user feature. I look forward to seeing you in the following video.